Something I absolutely cannot stand whenever I hear it is the narcissistic idea that George Lucas sold the rights, so he no longer has a say in regards to Star Wars. The main place where I hear this absolutely delusional argument is when sequel fans use this mindset to deflect the criticism that the sequels are badly made Star Wars films. Particularly, whenever something happens that doesn't line up with the rules set up by George Lucas. For example, the fact that George Lucas made it clear since the early days of the franchise that training is required to become a Jedi, that people like me use to prove that we are correct in calling Rey an unrealistically powerful character. I've disputed the George Lucas sold the rights argument in the video specifically about me explaining how the Force works, so go watch that for more context, but I intend to go into even more detail to prove up and down, left and right, forwards and backwards that people who say this have little to no integrity. And wrong, let's not forget that. They're dead wrong. First, everyone who has ever said this happens to be a sequel fan, aka someone who doesn't care all that much about the rules of Star Wars, and seems to have the impression that officiality means legitimacy. This is absurd when you think about it for more than 2 seconds. Do you think that a corporate entity like Disney would understand every single thing that they own? Gee, just look at classical Renaissance Disney movies. They're all adaptations of old books or fairy tales. And like them or not, they absolutely butcher the source material. Let's take Pocahontas for example. Pocahontas was a real person, but they got everything about her from beginning to end wrong. Pocahontas was like 10 when the English set up Jamestown, and there was certainly no romance between her and John Smith, as depicted in the movie. John Smith, in fact, was a scumbag to the 10th degree, as he'd ambush and steal from the natives. Also, Pocahontas was kidnapped and forced as a bargaining chip. She married an English guy that wasn't John Smith, and suspiciously died in her 20s, early 20s, from what many people believe to be poisoning. Quite a sad story. But Disney, instead of looking at historical evidence, just looked at John Smith's fantasized writings in which he brags about native bitches he got on his dick, including Pocahontas. It was absolutely disgusting. But Disney decided to use that as the basis for their movie. I'm not cherry picking either. I looked into a lot of the animated Disney movies, and most if not all of them butchered the source material or very, very loosely adapted them. I got a lot of the information from a YouTuber named John Solo, who he, in himself, is a Disney shill. His channel is full of shit about Disney movies and the Star Wars videos he's made. He made it clear that he likes the sequels and dislikes the prequels. Well, actually, I haven't kept track of what he thought about The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker, but my point stands. He wouldn't be a Disney-centric channel if he wasn't a Disney shill. Now, how this relates to Star Wars is the fact that if Disney can butcher the source material in their classics that every animation enthusiast reveres, they can absolutely do so with Star Wars. And they did. Ownership does not equal understanding. Period. Disney doesn't suddenly get to decide what Star Wars is or isn't. And the simple reason why is because they kept the original 6 movies around during the reboot. The original 6 movies are the bulk of George Lucas's work. If they did not want to abide by George Lucas canon, then they should have decanonized George Lucas canon. But they needed to leech off the popularity of Star Wars, and a sequel would generate more hype than a flat-out reboot. They chose to keep the OG 6 around, but just invalidate them with the dumbest ideas imaginable. Also misunderstanding what happened in the movies by not watching them properly. Again, George Lucas said that training is required to become a Jedi, and J.J. Abrams mistakenly thought that the Force is just something you believe in, and you reach out to it when shit gets tense. fucking idiot. They were literally changing the rules and having the story contradict itself. I point out the line that cloning was a secret only the Sith knew all the time, because that is just so blatantly wrong. And sequel fanboys haven't even given me a response to how this isn't incompetent writing by Disney. This argument about ownership is just so stupid. Next point. People who say this only say that because they're too selfish or lazy to have an actual argument. Pauper memes, among others, screeched about how decanonizing the sequels was selfish. And then when I point out the expanded universe, they just deny its previous canonicity because George Lucas said so. And then I point out how George Lucas wouldn't consider the sequels canon either, probably even less so than the expanded universe because they butcher his work. I pointed all of this out to Pauper memes, and you want to know what he told me? Seriously, just take a fucking guess. George Lucas sold the rights. When confronted with a double standard, using George as a scapegoat, excuses himself from his hypocrisy by having the bizarre belief that George Lucas, because he was no longer in charge, that he suddenly no longer had a say. Pauper memes and Goldman go on and on about respecting other people's opinions, but when it comes to George's say on the franchise, they don't stop for 1 second to consider how selfish that sounds. Of course, everyone who says George Lucas doesn't have a say anymore could not care less about what George thought while he owned Star Wars. And that's really how you know that these people have an agenda of coming up with whatever bizarre, batshit excuse they can come up with and roll with it. Regardless of whether or not they contradict themselves in the process, relying on George and then saying George doesn't matter anymore, that right there proves that you're just using George Lucas whenever you feel like it, rather than having basic moral integrity. Also, something that's weird about this is what happens when Kathleen Kennedy is no longer in charge of Lucasfilm? Or wait, who exactly owns Star Wars at this point? The ownership of Disney is rather broad. For simplicity's sake, let's say that the CEO of Disney is the owner of Star Wars and all the other shit that Disney owns. Bob Iger, who saw through the acquisition of Lucasfilm, is no longer in charge. That means everything he said about Star Wars or any other property under Disney no longer matters. Given he oversaw the first stage of the dreaded Disney Star Wars era, that means that everything he oversaw can be overwritten by the next CEO. What then? Novels like Ahsoka and comics like Kanan the Last Padawan have been overwritten, as a matter of fact. And you can bet your asses that it will continue. It's why I have no interest in the High Republic, because the novels were just being disregarded in a few years, because they can't show gay or trans Jedi to the Russian or Chinese audiences, because think of the profits. So what's the standard then? Let's say Disney is sold to an even bigger hypothetical corporation, and then they decide to decanonize the sequels. What then? You can't complain that the sequel shouldn't be decanonized because by your standards, the new owners of the franchise decide what Star Wars is or isn't. I know this won't happen because of monopoly law, but you're missing the point. The CEO of Disney and the head of Lucasfilm could change in the next 10 years and backtrack on everything Disney previously did with Star Wars, which is a distinct possibility since they're known today for retconning and backtracking. Like, seriously, this is not even a double standard. It's more like a triple standard, a term that doesn't even exist because there was no such thing until now. That is my complete and thorough explanation on why the George Lucas sold the rights argument is absolutely worthless and does nothing except highlight how incredibly desperate people are to defend a corporate entity. Disney would not do the same for you. They would sell you into chattel slavery at Disney World and overwork you until you collapse and die given the opportunity. This is a part of why Disney shills make no sense. They are defending a corporate entity. There's a reason why Disney is regarded as evil. That isn't just a fucking joke. Just look at all the Disney World accidents that are the result of negligence. What does this have to do with their movies, you might ask? Well, I mean, someone died during the filming of Indiana Jones 5. That tells you all you need to know. And people are still compelled to defend the final result, even if it's terrible. Like, seriously, Disney is dangerously close to being considered a human rights violator. If Disney had murdered George Lucas and then rewrote his will so that Star Wars would go to them, and the public didn't find out until 5 years later, there would still be people defending Disney. Like, seriously, what will it take for a Disney shield to come clean that maybe Disney isn't the best company in the world? I wonder. Well, that's the end of this video. It's all there, black and white, clear as crystal. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories about mystery boxes?
Water was running, children were running, you were running out of time. Under the mountain, a golden fountain, were you praying at the Loris shrine?